The main arguments against Bitcoin. Welcome to another episode of Understanding the Potential of Bitcoin according to Dr. Saifedean Ammous. My name is Nikolai, and today is actually the final and last episode of our 11-part series on this book, The Bitcoin Standard, the Decentralized Alternative to Central Banking. Well, it has been quite a journey. We covered quite some ground in the last couple of months. Bitcoin price has more than doubled since we started this series. I hope it's connected to the series because everybody watched it, and that actually didn't happen. But I think the arguments for a huge potential of Bitcoin are there, and I think more and more people get it. So this is the final episode, and I think it's really useful to end the series by asking, well, what are the main arguments against Bitcoin? And Dr. Ammous does a great job of addressing these questions very heads-on, and it's the last chapter called Bitcoin Questions, Chapter 10. Let's dive right in. The first objection against Bitcoin, and I hear that often, is, well, isn't it a huge electricity waste? Isn't Bitcoin mining using up so much energy for nothing? This is just a huge waste. Let's first define the word waste. Would we say it's a waste to light our rooms? Would we say it's a waste of electricity to have heat in the winter? No, because we get something out of that electricity. We have a value in return, and then it's not a waste. Well, the same is true for Bitcoin. If you understand the Bitcoin and how it works, you understand that the electricity serves a purpose and therefore it's not wasted. You have a huge value by expending that much energy, and that is what Dr. Ammous explains. So what is the value you get in return of consuming so much energy? Well, what you get is a huge network security. The security is guaranteed by expending energy. How does that work? Well, we have to think about how the miners get their rewards. Well, it works that way. A miner tries to solve a mathematical problem that is called proof of work. And in order to solve that, he has to expend a lot of energy because it's actually calculations that a computer runs, billions and billions of calculations until he guesses the right number, or actually a smaller number than a certain given number. And that usually takes about 10 minutes. So if he solves that, he can now put all the transactions that are in the mempool into that block and transmit that block out into the network. If he is the first to have done that, then he gets the block reward. And the block reward consists out of a block subsidy. That is a number of Bitcoins for every block. Right now it's 12.5 Bitcoins for every block you mine. So that is what you get. And then you get the transaction fees. That is the block reward. So the Bitcoin miner expends energy in order to be allowed to transmit a block to the ledger. The thing is, the security of the network is preserved by him having spent so much energy. Why? Because he has no incentive, after having spent so much energy to solve that block, to insert an invalid transaction into the block, because then the block gets rejected. So there's an economic incentive for the miner to be truthful. Dr. Ammous says, in Bitcoin, you have the conversion of electricity to truthful records. Let's think about it for a second. If a miner says, well, I'm just going to do some tricks here, we're going to do some double spending, and he inserts an invalid transaction in the block, then the thing is, there's a symmetry. People can check the validity of a block really quickly. They don't need to spend a lot of energy because you can find it out really quickly. So they will see, oh, that's an invalid block, and they will say, no, it doesn't conform to the consensus rules of Bitcoin, so we don't allow it. That means the miner now has spent thousands and thousands of dollars on the electricity he has used for that block for nothing. It's a waste. So the electricity consumption secures the truthfulness of the miners because they themselves are incentivized not to waste the money they have invested in the electricity. So it's actually not about the electricity, but it's about the money that you have to spend to use electricity. Objection number 2. Well, can't we just cannot just somebody come and change Bitcoin and then the whole thing doesn't work anymore. That's an argument you often hear. What about changing Bitcoin? Well, you first have to understand that this thing has been running for almost 10 years without any fundamental changes that have worked out. There have been many tries, but it hasn't worked out for the majority of the network. Why is that so? Well, there is a very, very strong status quo bias in the network. Why is that? Well, we have to understand what the value proposition of Bitcoin is, and Dr. Ammous writes that masterfully in his book on page 229. He says, Bitcoin's advantages lie not in its speed, not in its convenience or friendly user experience, but Bitcoin's value comes from it having an immutable, that's the defining word, an immutable monetary policy, precisely because nobody can easily change it. So that means the value proposition for Bitcoin is that you can't change it easily. And why can you not change it easily? Because the nodes are spread out through all the world, and there are thousands and thousands of it. So if you would want to change something, you would need to convince the majority of these nodes to adopt the changes of the protocol, how they accept blocks, for example, that they all of a sudden accept blocks that have a bigger size than 1 megabyte or something like that. But now those nodes are very, very strongly incentivized not to change it, because the immutability of the protocol is exactly what is so valuable about Bitcoin. Do you get it? Nobody can change the protocol really easily. That is what makes Bitcoin very, very valuable, and you can trust it. So the nodes would have a strong inclination to stick to that immutability. So if there is any proposal, hey, let's change something, then the nodes would need to think about, well, then we undermine the value proposition of our network. And that's exactly what happened so far. There has been in 2017 a huge proposal to change the block size of Bitcoin, and that is now called Bitcoin Cash. It was a hard fork. And what happened? Well, most of the nodes stuck to the old protocol, which is Bitcoin. And only, I think, Bitcoin Cash has a value like 3% of Bitcoin, so it's not a real competitor. And the nodes understood really quickly, if they would adopt those changes, then there could always be somebody coming saying, hey, I have some changes, hey, I have some changes, and all of a sudden you have a central figure who can change the protocol, and then you have a central point of failure, and that's exactly what Bitcoin was created against. The objection number 3 is that, well, how about adversarial attempts against Bitcoin? And that is under the title of Antifragility. So Nicholas Taleb wrote a book, Nassim Taleb, sorry, called the book Antifragility, and he writes about that there are things that actually gain from adversity and disorder. So all the attempts against Bitcoin so far have only made it stronger, because they have happened in a time when Bitcoin was not widely known in the beginning. The coders could use those attacks to identify weaknesses. And because it's an open source protocol, it has evolved really, really quickly to be secure against all those possible objections or flaws. And so far, now it's at a point where it's very, very strong, and every attack just makes it stronger. The next issue is scaling. Well, what about Bitcoin and its size? If you think about it, right now every block created every 10 minutes has 1 megabyte. That means you can have about 500,000 transactions a day in the whole Bitcoin network. And to be honest, that is nothing, because that means you have about 4 transactions a second. If you compare that to Visa, Visa has about 3,200 transactions per second. So many people have proposed, and especially the guys from Bitcoin Cash, we need to scale the block size so that Bitcoin can scale and we have more transactions. But they have not understood why that is a very, very bad idea. The idea is the following. If you have the same, if you want to have the same transaction number of Visa per second, you need a block size of 800 megabytes. That would mean every year there would be added 42 terabyte of data to the blockchain of Bitcoin. Now, every Bitcoin transaction is recorded with every single node in the whole network. Now think about if every single node would need to record 42 terabytes of data every year, that would mean that slowly but surely only the rich nodes could afford it, because you would need a huge computer, you would need great bandwidth to transfer the data, and that would lead to a more and more centralized system. And that's exactly what you have with Visa, for example. They have huge, like buildings where they store all their servers and all that stuff. It's very centralized, otherwise you can't make it with such huge sizes. So the small size of the blocks actually guarantee that the Bitcoin network stays decentralized. That is the whole point of it, because it's only 1 megabyte a block. Every single person that has access to a normal computer can start using the Bitcoin network, and that makes it very democratic. That makes it very widespread out, and that is a feature of the security of Bitcoin, because it has no single point of failure. As soon as you increase the block size, only rich people can afford to run a node, and therefore it gets more and more centralized, and therefore it is very likely to be attacked or to be changed. Now, what about scaling in general? We need scaling, right? Well, not really. It depends how you look at Bitcoin. I remember when I started out with Bitcoin, I thought, well, the main value proposition is that it has such fast transactions, so speed. But that's actually not the value proposition. If you want to use that, there's other services. The value proposition is that it's immutable, and it's censorship resistant, and it's inflation resistant. So it's more like a settlement layer. If you want to use it to buy a coffee, in the future, most likely Bitcoin won't be the place you will, the thing you will use, the currency you will use. There will be many off-chain services like the Lightning Network where you can do small payments with. Think about, like, as an analogy, you want to order a pair of Nike shoes from Amazon, and then Amazon just comes with a whole cargo ship to deliver it to your door because you live next to a river, for example. That would make no sense at all. Why? Because the capacity of that cargo ship is way too big for just a small thing. And that's exactly what Bitcoin is able to do. It's more like a settlement layer between central banks. So if I transact an amount of money to your bank account, and my bank and your bank, they will not settle every single transaction between people of their banks. That doesn't make sense. That's way too much energy consumed for a single transaction of 10 euros. What they will do, they will chunk all the transactions of a day, of a week, and at the end of the day of a week, they will transact, they will settle the whole amount. And that's exactly what happens with Bitcoin. It will be used, so the on-chain transactions, one of the 500,000 a day, will be used for big junking of transactions. And the small ones can easily run between off-chain channels with security, for sure, but not the same level of security that you have on the Bitcoin network. And you don't need that security for a €5 transaction. You need security for sure, but not that amount that you have on the on-chain. So it is actually a misunderstanding of how Bitcoin works if you think that it is supposed to have the same amount of transaction as Visa, for example. That is not what Bitcoin is thought for. It's a store of value. Okay, next objection. Another argument against Bitcoin is, hey, this is often used for criminal activities. It's great for criminals because it's anonymous. Well, actually, it's not anonymous. It's more pseudonymous. And actually, if you think about it, and that is something Dr. Ammous writes about, it's not very helpful for a criminal to use the Bitcoin network, because on the Bitcoin network, every transaction is recorded forever. So you can actually you can track down every single individual transaction. You can see like the whole path of transactions. From, of course, you don't see the name, you have a public address, but you can see the whole track of transactions, and therefore it's actually unsuited for criminals, because if there's any point where that public address has been connected to an IP address of a computer or to a name because you have used an exchange and you have done some KYC or whatever, then all of a sudden you can actually track down the whole route of how those transactions were carried out. So if you want to use it for criminal activities, you better not use a ledger where everything is recorded forever and can be tracked down by individuals who want to invest it. So then the big question is, how do we kill Bitcoin if all of this doesn't work? And their main objection is, hey, Bitcoin can just be hacked like anything else. Like all those exchanges have been hacked, and every computer system and the big companies have been hacked. So Bitcoin will eventually be hacked. Let's think about it. First of all, what would hacking Bitcoin actually mean? Well, if Bitcoin is a ledger of ownership of virtual coins, then hacking Bitcoin would mean that you corrupt the ledger, right? Because Bitcoin is a piece of software, corrupting it or hacking it would mean you would need to destroy the ledger of ownership of virtual coins. So that actually specifies what hacking Bitcoin actually means, and then you can think about, well, how could we actually do this? How could we corrupt the ledger? And I think it's very interesting that Bitcoin actually assumes every single node to be a hostile attacker, and it has been built to ensure that nobody can corrupt the ledger easily. How do they do it? Because of the proof of work model, that everyone who wants to insert a transaction to the block has to expend a lot of energy in order to be allowed to do it, and everybody can verify it very easily. So you pay a large cost to commit transactions to the record, and Dr. Ammous writes on page 242, if everyone is assumed dishonest, everyone must pay a large cost to commit transaction to the common record. And because there is a low cost of detecting fraud and there's a high cost of adding a block, there is a symmetry. And that asymmetry actually makes it very, very hard to corrupt the ledger. And so far, it hasn't been done, and it's very, very improbable. So if you want to hack Bitcoin, you would actually need to succeed to insert an invalid transaction. The miners themselves, of course, and then there comes the point of, well, what about a 51% attack? So if 51% of the miners decide to change the to insert an invalid transaction, well, then it would be hacked, right? Yeah, of course, but the thing is, the miners have a huge interest for the integrity of the network. Why? Well, because they get paid in Bitcoin. So if the network gets compromised, the miners themselves lose money, because the block rewards, which are paid in Bitcoin, will not be worth that much, because if the network is compromised, the Bitcoin price goes down and the miners will lose money. So the miners have a huge interest for the integrity of the network. That is very, very interesting, and it's a great game theoretical setup of the whole system. Well, what about governments then? They can just shut it down, right? Let's think about what would they need to do. Well, they would need to have 51% at least of the power, the hash rate power, in order to do it, and they would need to succeed the race of inserting invalid transaction in order to compromise the network faster than the miners who have a interest in the integrity of the network, they need to be faster than them. And that is very, very difficult, because that would mean they need to purchase the hardware necessary for this, and they would then need to, he writes, as an outsider entering the market, the attacker is at a constant disadvantage in his own purchasing of mining equipment, and it leads to the faster growth of the mining processing power not controlled by him. So it would be a race, and it would be very, very difficult to win that. Okay, and of course, it would cost so much money just in order to destroy it. They would actually have no profit themselves, right? So there's no real economic incentive to do it in the Bitcoin itself. Another question of the attacks is, what about internet attacks? Can we, if Bitcoin depends on the internet, right? So if the internet gets shut down, then Bitcoin can't survive. Not really, because you only need about 1 megabyte every 10 minutes. You need to transmit 1 megabyte of data every 10 minutes. So nowadays there's billions of devices who can do that. And there's also satellite systems right now that have been set up. So in order to kill Bitcoin from an internet perspective, we would have like an apocalyptic scenario where we have no electronic devices who are capable of transmitting all that data anymore. And that is very, very unlikely that we're going to see that. We're going to have other problems then if that is the case. And then Dr. Ammous says, well, the biggest threat against Bitcoin is returning to a sound money system. If the governments return to actually inflation-resistant sound money principles, maybe like a gold standard, then that would actually decrease the need for Bitcoin. But it looks very, very unlikely currently that they want to do this. Another question is, what about altcoins, alternative coins? Well, there's so many other currencies. Who says that Bitcoin is the one winning? Well, it's very interesting if you think about what we have discussed so far, that the value proposition of Bitcoin is its immutability. And the altcoins that come after Bitcoin, they have not had that advantage of growing in the jungle alone for years and years and years without the public seeing them, and therefore like developing all these strengths, right? They have official initial coin offerings, ICOs. They have a team of developers behind them who market them, who design them, and therefore they immediately have a leader. They have a team. And as soon as you have a team, there's not really any competition with Bitcoin, because if you have a team that's in charge, you have a single point of failure. If you have somebody who's marketing the coin, you have somebody who's in charge. And if you have somebody who's in charge, you can get that person to do whatever with the currency. A government could come in and just pressure those people to destroy the currency or whatever. So it's really, really difficult for another currency to function as digital cash and sound money, because it has to be outside of the control of a third party. And that is just the beginner advantage of Bitcoin, that it was able to grow slowly in the jungle and develop all these strengths, and nobody else can have that again, because now it's out in the open and it will be attacked immediately. So there's a huge dilemma for altcoins. Either you're going to market them, but then you have a clear team who's in charge, it's centralized, or you're not going to market it and just let it grow, but that won't happen because everybody will go to the one thing that's already working like that, which is Bitcoin. And the last topic that he discusses is, well, isn't blockchain the real thing? And he has this great little image that he asked the question, blockchain. He says, how do you decide if you need a blockchain? And he says, do you need digital cash? Yes, then use Bitcoin, the only blockchain that works. Do you need digital cash? No, you don't need a blockchain. So a blockchain is incredibly wasteful of resources, energy, money. It's very, very complicated. And he says the Bitcoin mechanism for establishing the authenticity and validity of the ledger is extremely complex and complicated, and it has one purpose, that you issue a currency without the need for a trusted third party. So there is a trade-off. You get a system without a trusted third party for using a blockchain. But using a blockchain is incredibly complex, complicated, and it's wasteful of resources. So pretty much every other company has no incentive to remove the third party, because the company that issues the blockchain is the third party. So he uses this analogy with when the automobile was invented with Benz. He wanted to replace horses, right, with the engine. He didn't want to put the engine on top of the horse. He didn't want to make a horse faster. He wanted to replace the horse. So the analogy is this. If a company says we want to run our system faster and we're going to add a blockchain on it, it's like putting an engine on the back of a horse. It's going to actually slow down the horse because it needs that much energy. It's very complicated. The only reason why you as a company would need a blockchain is for you to be replaced by the blockchain. And that would mean you don't have a CEO anymore, you don't have a developers team. The blockchain is there for a system of no trust. And of course, as a company, you don't want that. It's your company. You want people to pay for you to do the work and for you to trust. So he says there's no future for blockchains except in Bitcoin, which makes it an interesting question why there's so much hype about blockchains. Okay, that is it. We have now tackled a lot of the main objectives against Bitcoin, the main arguments against Bitcoin. This has been very much fun to me to go through that book and to discuss these topics with you. I hope you have learned as much as I did. I'm very, very thankful for the thorough and good work of Dr. Ammous, and I will keep thinking about these topics. If you like the video, please write some comments. If also criticism, I would love to learn from you. I'm sure that you know so much more than I do. I'm just a beginner, but I wanted to share some of those concepts, and I wish you all the best. See you soon.